watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and needless to say, a great deal of attention is being focused on the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian talks, which began in Washington at the beginning of September between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. Might these talks bear some real fruit, or are these talks a charade in which each side is participating to keep America and the Obama administration happy? Well, for some insight on the current peace talks, I am very pleased to be joined now by Dr. Leonard Grob, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at New Jersey's Fairleigh Dickinson University, and a man who's devoted much of his illustrious academic career to writing about the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. For example, Dr. Grob is the co-author and co-editor, along with Israeli-Palestinian professor, also an American citizen, Dr. Mahmoud Watad, also of Fairleigh Dickinson, of a book entitled Teen Voices from the Holy Land, a collection of 34 candid first-person narratives of ordinary Palestinian and Israeli teenagers, published by Prometheus Books, Amherst, New York. And Lenny Grob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I want to begin by just getting a general assessment from you of the peace talks. Lenny, do you think they're for real?
My sense, it's a guarded optimism that I feel. We have to support, it seems to me, each and every one of us has to support the potential that these talks will bear fruit. It is certainly a gift that the two, Abbas and Netanyahu, are sitting down together, that teams are meeting, that there's a commitment to meet every 2 weeks. And I believe that there are strong possibilities with the year's time limit for at least a framework agreement. I believe that there is the possibility that, in fact, peace is closer than it has been certainly any time in the last 10 years.
Why is that? Why is it closer now?
I think the two sides have come to the realization that, and I think this is a realization in the gut, not just something that is an intellectual perusal of the situation. I think the two sides really understand now that if there are going to be two states, if there is going to be a state with a Jewish majority, Israel, and if there is going to be a state in which Palestinians can realize their own aspirations for self-determination, time is running out. The demographics are not on the side of either side.
Why aren't they on the side of the Palestinians?
They're not on the side of the Palestinians because Israel is more and more establishing facts on the ground. And there is talk really just in the last several months among those on the right in Israel of the possibility of one state in which at some time in the future, eventually the Palestinians may achieve some kind of autonomy. But facts on the ground simply mean that with the occupation, and with the occupation expanding as it has done, with now 300,000 Israeli Jews living in the territories and another 200,000 roughly living in East Jerusalem, I think that the Palestinians realize that time is not on their side either. It's conventional to say that the Palestinians will wait and wait and wait.
That's correct.
And I think that there is a new realism. I think this is especially the case with Salam Fayyad, the Palestinian Prime Minister. I had an opportunity to meet with him. I was part of a group that met with him in Ramallah in March. I saw firsthand what I believe was a seriousness of purpose. And the fact that there is state building going on means that the Palestinians are no longer waiting for peace to come to them. They are taking some initiative, they are taking strides themselves to do state building with Fayyad, who is a world-recognized economist, and with Abbas, who, like Netanyahu, does not want to go down in history as a failed president, a failed prime minister. I believe they both see time running out.
May I just give you some of the arguments that somebody sitting across from me who disagrees with you might pose for you?
Please.
And it's interesting, Lenny. Recently I spoke with Yishai Fleischer, who is the managing editor of Arutz Sheva, Israel National Radio. He is on the right, on the far right. He's from the settler community. And when I spoke to him, my questions represented what I consider to be the other side of the argument from him. I want to present to you, if Yishai were sitting here, some of the things he would say to you. I would love to hear not necessarily what you would think for yourself, but how you would answer in terms of the process that we're now watching. And the Yishai Fleischers are arguing that there still is within the Palestinian mentality a resentment, a feeling that in some way, again, that it was a Nakba, it was a catastrophe, that the State of Israel was ever created. There shouldn't be a Jewish state at all, a Zionist entity, and that what these peace negotiations are really, from a Yishai Fleischer's perspective, is an attempt to slowly, step by step, dismantle the Jewish state. Is there anything that you see, anything you've gained from talking to the people you talk to, which would indicate to you a change of perspective within the Palestinian community, that they now, the leadership now, and enough of the people on the ground really want to live side by side, Olam Va'ed, with the Jewish state?
First of all, it's very hard to characterize Palestinians as such.
Interesting. Why is that?
Because there are Palestinians and there are Palestinians. And the Palestinians on the ground whom I have encountered and whom I have read, and whose voices that I hear at peace education conferences in the Middle East, are those who may not love their Israeli Jewish brothers and sisters, but who understand that if they are to have a state of their own, they're going to have to live together with them as neighbors. There is a strong Palestinian narrative, as there is a strong Israeli Jewish narrative, and part of that narrative has to do with what you just mentioned, the sense of the Nakba having occurred, the Palestinians as victims. That is not going to go away easily. My sense, though, is that pragmatics are going to take over, and that once they are close to having their state, more and more are going to realize, and this I include those living in Gaza, Palestinians living in Gaza, are going to realize that what life is about is good schools for their kids. It's about good working conditions. It's about clean water. It's about building a life and wanting the same things that Israeli Jews want and the same things that you and I want. We want to care for our kids. We want to make sure that our kids have good schools and grow up with an open destiny.
We also wanted our homeland. For years and years, well, forget 2,000 years, in our lifetime, Jews prayed to return to Eretz Yisrael, a Jewish homeland. It was something Jews wanted very, very badly. It is possible that there are Palestinians who want it just as badly. And there were many people who say you can't buy Palestinians. And giving them water and good schools doesn't address for them any more than it would have addressed for us, we Jews. a compromise on our wanting the state of Israel?
Well, first of all, Israeli Jews did compromise.
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, they agreed with
to share
UN
the land.
Resolution 181 to share the
always,
land.
That's right.
So there is no reason to think that Palestinians are sewn out of a different cloth altogether.
You have seen some expression of a new desire, a new willingness, I should say, to share the land.
I have. Now, of course, my group is the group that I'm talking about is somewhat selective in nature. I, as an American Jew who does work with Israelis on the left, I tend to encounter those Palestinians who share views about two states for two peoples. So I can say that I'm familiar. I've been to Gaza 3 times, but not recently. And I can't speak for Hamas, and I'm not discounting the force that ideology has on people's lives. It's very strong. But it seems to me that the pragmatics of everyday life can be made stronger. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean, just as it didn't mean for Jews to give up all of Palestine, mandate Palestine, in 1947. They accepted the partition. Mm-hmm. I think Palestinians will more and more accept partition and have their own state. Of course, only on 22% of what was historic mandate Palestine.
Because Transjordan was lopped off to begin with.
Yes.
Okay. But on the remaining portion of Palestine, your sense is now, the people you speak to, the academics you speak to, those on the left you speak to and respect, they express to you, in no uncertain terms, the same Jewish mentality. It is fair to share the land.
I think they don't speak in terms of abstractions. And I know that Netanyahu would like expressions such as, I recognize you as the state of the Jewish people, as a Jewish state. I think they don't speak in abstractions. They speak very pragmatically about the fact that the Palestinians need a state of their own. They need it on as much of the West Bank as will be possible in the negotiations. Actually, 100% of the 1967 borders, with a land swap of anywhere from 2 to 5%, I believe, are the numbers being talked about. They talk in those terms rather than saying, I now understand that it would only be just for me to relinquish my claims and no longer say that there is an Arab waqf, an Arab trust in all of Palestine. They don't speak in those terms.
And do we care whether they do or not?
My sense is that that is a line of thinking which will not bear fruit.
And is it okay? In other words, if you were heading the state of Israel, would you say, I don't need that kind of statement. I need a pragmatic, to use your word, practical peace solution where two states will live side by side, and I don't really care what they say. Is Netanyahu wrong to make an issue asking Abbas to say he recognizes Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East?
If this is understood as a precondition to going further with the peace talks, yes, he is making a mistake. I would not want to claim that what one says has no relevance whatsoever. One of my other fields of interest and expertise is Holocaust studies. Mm-hmm. I know very well that we need to take heed of what people say, because often saying leads to doing. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to say that we need not heed at all the words of the other, but this is not the right time to say either acknowledge that this is the state of the Jewish people or we are not going to go any further. Mm-hmm. Just, I think that this will come. It will come in time, and it will come, I think, over a matter of years, if not decades.
But you would make peace in the interim.
I would make peace. I would make peace that was based on clearly defined borders, something that Israel has not had. I'm a lover of Israel, and I feel that Israel's security lies not in her arms primarily, not to say that arms are not important,
Of course.
but her security lies in a just peace in which neither side obtains all that they wish, in which each side's narrative is to some degree limited by the other's narrative, what I call forming an internarrative. And neither side's narrative will be realized, but there will be enough of a meeting so that two states will be created and people will get busy with their everyday lives and ideology will fade to the margins. There will still be some terrorist attacks. They're not going to stop immediately, but increasingly those on the margins are going to be pushed further aside. They will have less and less influence as people busy themselves with the concerns of everyday life.
Can you explain to us how the Jewish narrative needs to be limited?
Yes, insofar as the Jewish narrative learns, for example, from the Shoah, from the Holocaust, that only one lesson, never again will Jewish blood be shed with impunity. That is an important lesson, but it is not the only lesson. I think Jews will need to free themselves of a sense of victimhood. Jews will need to take risks for peace, because in not doing so, they do truly endanger themselves and become possible victims. They will have to take the risk. The Jewish narrative is built to, in some substantial measure, on what some have called the Matzadah complex, the sense of a siege mentality. And I believe that the Shoah teaches us many lessons. They teach us lessons about how to deal with the poor one, the oppressed, the stranger in one's land. I am very proud to be a Jew with a strong ethical legacy. Justice, justice shalt thou pursue. That to me is also part of the Jewish narrative, that Jews need a land of their own, that Jews have a right to self-determination. I believe in that sense I am a Zionist. And though I am on the left, I believe that I represent a kind of Zionism which will make for the security of the people of Israel and will also be true to our ethical legacy as Jews.
Okay. Forgive me, I don't hear a compromise in the Jewish narrative as it applies to Eretz Yisrael.
Well, the compromise will be to give up the land on the West Bank.
No, we did that already. We did that before. We did that early in the 30s. We did it in the 40s, and we've done it ever since. That's nothing new. I thought you were saying that for this peace to occur, a narrative has to change within the Jewish community. I don't see any change based on what you've described. I know what the change has to be on the Arab side. Mm-hmm. The Arab side has to say, after refusing to want to share the land, be willing for any reason to share the land, the Arab narrative must change, that for whatever their pragmatic explanation to themselves is, they're now ready to share the land. What's the change you think is necessary in the Jewish narrative?
The change that is necessary, I'm not talking about the kind of, quote, giving up that you're mentioning in the 30s and 40s and 50s. I'm talking about the withdrawal of large numbers of settlers and the sense on the part of Israel that they can trust their Palestinian neighbors. A lot of the Jewish narrative has been defined negatively as somehow existing in perpetual conflict, that there is the perpetual Amalek. The current Amalek is the Palestinians. That will have to change.
Okay. Has that been a lie? Do you think factually on the ground the Palestinians have not been a real threat to the Israelis?
I don't think it's a lie. I think it's a mono perspective. I think it is, Palestinians have certainly not taken every opportunity that came about to realize their own aspirations. They have been their own enemy, and I think there are many Palestinians whom I've encountered who would say just that to me. There are no innocent parties in the Middle East. The Palestinians have their own share of blame.
Their own share of blame.
Their share of blame, yes.
And Jews have their share of blame.
They do.
And you think there's a moral equivalency between the two?
I don't like to talk in terms of moral equivalencies.
But that's what you're expressing here.
No,
you're making it sound like there are two sides that are basically almost like nasty children, equally to blame.
I wouldn't put any quantitative notion, I wouldn't attach a quantitative notion to it.
Because you don't want to, or because you don't think there is one?
It's because I think it's fruitless to do that.
Why?
Because you have two parties, each of which have done things which have been against their true self-interest. And it seems to me that that's what we need to do, is to try to establish correctives to that, so that each can realize their self-interest. And to say that what the Palestinians have done is worse than what the Israelis have done, it seems to me is just going to perpetuate a conflict of two narratives which will never meet.
Well, the Israelis right now are saying, and they've said over and over again, if in fact Palestinians want to live in peace with us, we would welcome that. And up until now, as you've said, the narrative within the Palestinian community has been to reject that notion. You seem to be optimistic that there has been a change, whether it's pragmatically driven or whether it's ideologically driven. There's been a change now within the Palestinian leadership and enough of the Palestinian people that the narrative that has been operative in the Palestinian community since before the establishment of the State of Israel is now about to change. And I think Israel, I don't know, every Israeli I talk to, whether on the right or left, want peace. Then the question is strategy. And so, again, if I have a Yishai Fleischer here, his strategy is they should leave us alone and they should let us be whatever we want to be. He does not. He represents maybe 10% of the Israeli people.
Yes.
90% of the Israeli people, tomorrow, you and I know, if Netanyahu could make a legitimate peace with Abbas, 90% of the Israeli people would say, you give up every inch of the West Bank, you take the settlers, you put them in somehow inside the Green Line, and we'll work it out. There are 10% of the Israeli people who, for various reasons, are somehow adamant that all of greater Israel belongs to the Jews. The biblical Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jews. But they don't represent Israeli policy, and they certainly don't represent the Israeli people. The problem we've had is, and I'll respect your wanting to say, let's not try to quantify who did what to whom, because that's the past. We're now going to look to the future. Correct. So looking to the future, the best thing could be if Netanyahu, who at one time would not have been meeting with Abbas this way, says, okay, if you can guarantee Israeli security, which is what he says over and over again, just guarantee my security and we will make a peace agreement. You can't guarantee my security if you want 1.5 million or 2 million refugees to be able to come back into Israel, and I have to have defensible borders, and I have to have some guarantees that you're going to not arm this state the way southern Lebanon and Gaza was armed. Do that for me, and we'll work out the water rights. We'll work out where this 2-5% of trade of land is. We'll work everything out. And all of a sudden, those of us who are hopeful say, Abbas represents a Palestinian orientation that is willing to make the compromises that are necessary for a peace to be made between the two. And I even believe, you may think I'm being naive here, I believe even Jerusalem, a piece of East Jerusalem, would be given up by Israel if everything else were worked out. We'd give East Jerusalem also as a capital for the new Palestinian state. The question that I always get from the Izzy Liebler community is, how do you trust people who say one thing in the American Western media and say something diametrically opposed in the Arab media, who say they're not going to compromise, who say that the right of return of Palestinians is an absolute precondition? Don't talk to me about any kind of swap of land. We're going to want the 67, it's really the 48 armistice line to be the border of the new Palestinian state. And my question for you is, what is it that you see and what do you hear from the people you talk to that makes you think there has been the sea change necessary on the Palestinian side that would make a compromise now, in your mind, optimistically probable?
When you say how Netanyahu understands peace from the Israeli side, I'm not sure that this is a package which the Palestinians can embrace wholly.
Give me an example.
An example, troops along the Jordan Valley.
And you would, if you were Prime Minister of Israel, you don't think those troops are necessary?
I think that temporarily, and temporarily in the Middle East can mean decades.
Okay.
I think temporarily there will need to be an international force led by the United States.
Netanyahu won't accept that?
There has been talk that we cannot trust international forces. Look what happened in Egypt. Look what has happened on the Lebanese border. They will flee at the first moment when things get hot.
Did they?
I think.
Did they?
Well, in some cases, yes.
In which cases, no?
In some cases, yes.
In which case, no?
Well, in Lebanon, they have, they have continued to be on the border, to man the border. But let me say this: I think the United States is going to have to play a crucially important role here, because Israel does not trust the international community, in quotes, the international community. They will trust a United States-led force to patrol the border on a temporary basis. I think that the Palestinians will not agree, nor do I believe that they should agree to an Israeli IDF presence on their eastern border along the Jordan River.
I understand.
So if you're telling me that this is Netanyahu's position on peace and that this is what we're offering, please take it, and anything that all the rest has to come from you, I think that Netanyahu is going to have to give as well.
Okay.
This is one point which he's going to have to give.
I would not be surprised if Netanyahu agreed to a NATO force being stationed at the Jordan River. Would you be surprised?
I would be surprised. I, though, am optimistic that as part of the larger package, that ultimately this will be acceptable. I don't think that right now, if they were to say up or down an international force, Netanyahu will agree. But as the talks develop, this will be an ingredient, and eventually this will be acceptable, especially if the United States takes the lead.
Okay, so we do agree.
Okay.
Netanyahu will accept it. You're just saying he won't accept it a priori. He'll accept it as a part of a larger package.
Yes.
Okay. Is there something else that Netanyahu you think would want that makes it difficult for Abbas to make peace with him?
Obviously, the right of return is a very, very, I think, the most difficult of issues, even more difficult than Jerusalem.
Okay, and
my view.
If you were prime minister, what would you do with the right of return?
Okay. There has to be the kind of agreement where both sides feel that they've won something and can go back to their respective constituencies and say, here is what we have achieved at the peace talks. Otherwise, you really don't have agreement. You just have a new kind of ceasefire. And we know what happens to ceasefires in this region. I think that what Israel will need is a guarantee that there will be no fully open option for the nearly 5 million, some say more, refugees to return. They will, that's what Israel will demand and what the Palestinians will have to agree to.
I'm sorry, what will they have to agree to?
They'll have to agree that there not be the open option for each and every refugee to choose to come back within the Green Line.
What will the option be?
Well, first of all, there will be some token, there'll be token acceptance, probably on humanitarian grounds, of anywhere, I hear anywhere numbers from 20,000 to 50,000, as much as 100,000 Palestinians, whether it's based on those who were living in 48, whether it's based on family connections, they will find a way to accept a token number. This is to allow Abbas to go back to his people and say, yes, some of our people are returning.
There is a right of return. It might not be total.
That's
but
correct.
Okay. And will, in your mind, both sides be willing to agree to that compromise?
I believe they will. There's more to the package. I think there will need to be compensation.
But Israel has already said that they would compensate.
Yes, but they have said that, but they've said it in terms of, no right of return. And the last point, which I haven't yet made, which I think will allow for the possibility of the Palestinians accepting this, which is an important part of their narrative, which they will have to give up, will be that there will have to be some acknowledgement on the part of Israel of their responsibility for what happened in 1948. I have heard Palestinian after Palestinian say to me, we know we're not all going to come back. We know that those rusty keys are no longer, there's no doors for them to open. But what we want is acknowledgement of our pain. And I think that this is something that Israel is going to have to do, along with, as part of the agreement, the understanding that this is a final agreement and that the door is not left open. And I think Israel is afraid. I heard this said by some members of the Knesset. They are afraid that any kind of acknowledgement will leave the door open a crack to refugees returning.
I've heard that too.
I do not believe that that is necessarily the case at all, and it will have to be taking a risk for peace to have that acknowledgement. So what I'm talking about is a humanitarian gesture to allow the other side to claim some kind of victory, and acknowledgement of what occurred, and compensation. I think that that package is one which many Palestinians who want a two-state solution already know in their heart of hearts is going to be part of the final agreement.
Okay, so you're saying that you believe Abbas could sell that?
It will be a hard sell, but yes.
Because if you don't believe he can sell it, then really you don't believe this is possible.
I do believe.
Okay, and you also believe that Netanyahu could accept it as well?
I do.
Okay. If Israel articulates this notion that we understand and respect the pain caused individual Palestinians by the establishment of the State of Israel, does Israel have a right to ask then for something you referred to earlier, Palestinian articulation of Israel's existence as a Jewish state?
Again, I think, I said that words do matter, and I think that this will come, and I also said that this will come in time. I don't think that this is the moment. I repeat what I said earlier. I don't think this is the moment to make this demand as a point of departure.
Why? Because what you make such a strong case for Israel saying something that would make Palestinians feel better. Why wouldn't you ask the Palestinians to do the exact same thing for the Israelis?
First of all, I think acknowledging that this is a Jewish state has ramifications, as Abbas sees it, for the 1.2 million Palestinians living with Israeli citizenship. To call something, I understand that the Declaration of Independence...
It is a Jewish state, Lenny, they would not be saying anything that isn't real. The United Nations established this as a Jewish state. The world understands this as a Jewish state. The Arabs have refused to accept that it's a Jewish state. All we're asking them to do, all Netanyahu wants, is what seems to be the crux of the issue. Say there should be a Jewish state in the Middle East. If you can't say that, if I'm Netanyahu, and the other side can't say, yes, you Jew, you have a right to a state in the Middle East. We will live side by side with your Jewish state. If you can't say that, I am suspect of what you really want of me.
What the Palestinians will do is enact it, not say it at this point. They will enact it in the concrete terms of the peace agreement.
Then why don't you argue the same thing for the Israelis? Why do they have to say anything to the Palestinians? They will show by their deed. Why can't the Israelis show by their deed as much as the Palestinians? Why is there this disconnect
because
here?
You
think the Palestinians were hurt more than the Jews?
Again, I don't want to. I don't want to
but
quantify.
You're asking the Jews to do something. You're not willing to ask the Palestinians. I don't understand why.
First of all, Elie Wiesel says, "Wherever there is suffering, that is the center of the universe." So I don't want to get into moral equivalences, arguments about moral equivalence. Who has suffered more? I want to say this: there is a strong narrative, a narrative that has prevailed for decades upon decades. And in order to address that element of the narrative, Israel, as the stronger party, has an obligation, it seems to me, to have that acknowledgement be made on their part. And if they see that at this point the Palestinians cannot utter the words, but can do the deeds, it seems to me that Israel needs here to enact something with generosity.
Okay. You haven't convinced me, but you've stated your position very clearly, and obviously the audience will respond one way or the other. I want to ask you about the extent to which Abbas does, in fact, in your mind, represent the Palestinian people. And I'm watching Charlie Rose, Lenny. Mm-hmm. And Charlie Rose interviews Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Mm-hmm. And Ahmadinejad says to Charlie Rose, what right does Mahmoud Abbas have to lead the Palestinian people? The only real election was in Gaza, and he lost. He was supposed to have an election about a year ago on the West Bank. He refused to hold the elections because he knew he would lose. Who is he representing, and what right does he have to represent us, to represent the Palestinians? And the reason why it's such an interesting question is Israel is being asked to make concessions, to make the statements you want them to make, based on a real conviction that this particular human being, representing at the moment as much of a valid government as one can hope the Palestinians have, that he is a real leader. And those who challenge Abbas, either because of what he says in the Arabic press, or because people don't see him as a duly elected, duly recognized leader of the Palestinian people, worry that he can't deliver. That's the real issue. Even if he means well, he can't deliver.
Okay. Let me say, first of all, that in the presidential election, prior to the election in which Hamas prevailed
in Gaza,
I would argue that the last election saw Abbas be chosen by a substantial majority of Palestinians. In terms of his refusing last January to hold elections again, this is after a coup, and I think that it was more than reasonable, not for you to say that he did this, postpone the election because he knew he would lose, I think is a supposition on your part.
Then why didn't he hold elections?
I think that right now you have a Palestinian group in Gaza and you have a Palestinian entity on the West Bank. And I think that he is holding out for a time when they will be reunited. And I think that he understands that if there is a viable peace treaty in which the Palestinians gain their state, the people of Gaza will no longer elect Hamas as their leader. They will see the benefits. Yes. So that's the first point, that I do believe he has legitimacy in terms of the law. In terms of what's happening on the ground, it's much more complex. Mm-hmm. And it's tenuous. I have to agree with you that we don't know how this is going to play out. I will say that Salam Fayyad has made great strides and that there are more believers every day. For the first time, the Palestinian ministries have transparent financials. For the first time, there is actual institutions being built daily. And I think people are catching a sense that there is movement. And hopefully Abbas will be able to capitalize on this and that people will be supportive of him. Will it be easy? No. Is he a charismatic leader who will draw people automatically to his side? No. It will be a sell, just as I'm not as optimistic as you. Netanyahu will also have to sell. You say 90% of people are going to support Netanyahu. Netanyahu will have a sell. Both leaders will have to sell this.
Yeah, you and I do disagree
to their
there.
peoples.
We disagree.
Yes.
I believe there's an enormous consensus in Israel, and Netanyahu has helped create it and represents it. But I understand what you're saying as well. I want to tell you an anecdote, and I want you to just respect me to respond to it. You know who David Broza is. Mm-hmm. And David Broza is someone on the left, and he's sort of like the Bob Dylan or Paul Simon of Israel. And I have enormous regard for him, and I love him very much. And we've talked to him many times about his view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when you talk to David Broza, he talks about all the people who he knows who are Palestinians, who he respects and really loves, and who he feels loves David Broza as well, the Palestinians. And that in his work in East Jerusalem, in his East Jerusalem studio, he works with a Palestinian musician. And I said to him, does your Palestinian musician friend and colleague, does he want to live with you in peace? And he said, yes. He understands the whole concept of we will share the land, we will live side by side in peace. And it was very lovely to hear him say this. A day or so after the interview, he called me. He said, Mark, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to take his name off. When I mention his name, bleep it out. I don't want his name to be heard on the program because I fear for him. And I thought to myself, if they're still at a point where Palestinians who want to live with Israelis are afraid of being known, what does that say about the larger possibilities for peace at this time? And Lenny, I want your reaction.
Let me say this. It's not going to happen easily or soon. I mentioned a framework agreement within a year. I do not believe that all the details are going to be worked out within a year's time. I do believe that setting a time limit is a good thing. It forces both parties to try to achieve as much compromise as possible. This is an educative process. And Palestinians and Israeli Jews are going to have to be co-educated. They're going to have to be educated toward trusting one another. And it will no longer be the case once this educational process takes place, and it's going to take place again over years and not over months. There will no longer be a substantial number of Palestinians who will say, you're talking about peace, you're not a real Palestinian, or in fact, you're someone who deserves to be killed. And this, unfortunately, is the case among some now. By the way, among the settler population, we also have a good number who are ready at any perceived concession to simply storm a Palestinian village on the West Bank and do some physical damage as well. Not all the talk of violence or acts of violence are coming from the Palestinian side.
Are you making a moral equivalency again?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that violence is not to be associated with only one side.
But there is a certain, you educate me now, because I have said time and time again on the air, I believe in a two-state solution, not for demographic reasons, but because it's fair. And that from the time the Jewish Yishuv understood that the Arab world was not going to say, yippee, let's have Palestine become a Zionist entity, but in fact they saw it as some kind of affront to their own national dignity. And there was a narrative early on in Jewish history that we learned in the 50s and in Talmud Torah that there was no such thing as Palestinian nationalism. That turns out to be a lie. It was a distortion. Palestinian nationalism goes back well before the establishment of the State of Israel. Okay. But there was this notion that in some way the Jew had an orientation. And my feeling is the Jew has always said, the official Jewish position has been, we will share the land. And the acceptance of the 48 partition gave the State of Israel this cockamamie border that really would have been almost impossible to defend. And it was only after the War of Independence that we got a slightly better armistice line. So I believe that the Jew should be sharing the land because it's the right thing to do. And I also believe that the Jew has always been sensitive, as you pointed out earlier, to the pain even of one's enemy. And I like that about the Jewish people. And so there should be a two-state solution. At the same time, I try to be as objective as I can be. So you educate me. You try to say that one shouldn't compare violence to violence. Do you know who Rabbi Seth Mandel is?
I don't actually
know. Okay. Rabbi Seth Mandel had a son named Kobe. And Kobe was something like 12 years old. He went out just out for a walk. They lived on the West Bank. He went out for a walk with a friend. And Arab Palestinians took rocks and bashed their heads in. Killed them dead. I don't say there has been no pain experienced by the Palestinians. I think any Jew who doesn't understand what an F-15 can do, both in terms of fear and in destruction and in absolute devastation, doesn't understand anything. But Jews normally don't go out of their way to just brutally destroy kids on a hike. And the fear that the Israelis have lived with, especially prior to the establishment of the fence along the West Bank border, was that at any point in time, people were going to come in and felt they had the moral right to blow kids up in a pizza shop or in a discotheque or at a bus stop or in a bus or in a Passover celebration in a yeshiva, and that, or in a school in Ma'alot, and that this is what the Israelis have endured and lived with. And I don't think, Lenny, there's any Jewish equivalency to that.
Let me say this to you. First of all, you know that this is as abhorrent to me, the suicide bombings, is as abhorrent to me as it is to you. I don't want to type the Palestinian people as those who don't care about innocent human lives. I think there are those who are extremists who don't care. By the way, I think there are some on the other side as well.
Give me examples. Give me examples. Give me, when you say that,
yes,
it's this attempt again to make it an equivalency. Give me an example of Jews going out and bashing in the heads of Palestinian kids.
Well, what is usually called collateral damage, when large missiles are hurled or are dropped from planes on houses where it's clear that there are civilians nearby, I'm not sure that we can simply write this off as collateral damage.
You don't see a difference. You don't see a difference in going out and bashing a kid's head in, and at the same time collateral damage, which is tragic, but is the result of an action that has provoked some kind of military response.
Mark, my view is that we should work not on saying what the Palestinians did here was terrible because there were innocents in a pizza shop. And over here, what happened is we dropped a many-ton bomb and just happened to kill X number of civilians. I don't think that we should be in the business of weighing. I think we should be in the business of attempting to find ways to bring the peoples together. And one thing I haven't heard from you at all as you talk about Jewish compassion for Palestinians is the presence of 300,000 settlers on the West Bank.
For me,
yes,
I believe Israel will remove them in a heartbeat, but I do not feel that it is equivalent to what pain has been caused by death. In other words, for me, the issue becomes one of, is it a wise thing to do? Is it a smart thing to do? I don't think it has anything to do with right or wrong or morality or legality. I believe the West Bank was basically unsovereign territory. It was unsovereign from the moment the Ottoman Empire took it and then was destroyed at the end of World War I. No one had sovereignty at all, maybe to this day. Jordan at one point annexed the West Bank, and virtually nobody but Pakistan and Britain accepted that annexation. Mm-hmm. And as far as the world is concerned, this has been no man's land. And most of the settlements, very few exceptions, the settlements are not in the midst of Palestinian areas, and you know that.
Yes.
And that the only argument is, one day this is going to be a Palestinian state, and Jews don't belong here. And we haven't talked about the morality of somebody saying a piece of land should be Judenrein. And for Abbas to say, not only will I not accept an Israeli force on the Jordan River, Abbas has said, if there are NATO forces, no Jew may be part of that NATO force. No Jew may live here, and no Jew may serve in NATO. I didn't want to get into that kind of detail with you, but for me, it's not about the West Bank. For me, the issue of compassion is in the West Bank. That's a matter of, there's sensitivity perhaps. And I understand the argument that if you build settlements and you continue to build settlements while saying you want peace, you continue to build settlements, are you sending the wrong message? I understand that. But do I think it's a matter of compassion? No.
In other words, you believe that the way Palestinians on the West Bank have been living since 1967 is because there have not been the kinds of bombings that have been carried out by Palestinians. So you believe that it's a rather minor inconvenience?
What is?
The presence of the 300,000 settlers.
Yes.
The Israeli-only roads.
Yes.
The checkpoints.
Yes. And not only that, there were time and time again opportunities to close all that down. All that down. In 1967, Levi Eshkol said you can have it virtually all back. In 2000, you can have it all back. I don't believe Israel isn't there because it wants to be there. Do I believe some of the settlers are there because they want to be there? Yes. And do I even believe that there was a brief period of time when the Ariel Sharons and the Begins, and then even some of the Labor Party thought, well, if we're not going to have peace, let's bring settlements in because maybe de facto it'll become the greater Israel. Yes, I do. But they proved to be wrong. The Israeli people don't see it that way. It's not Israeli policy. And if there could be peace, you and I agree, those settlements will come down in a heartbeat. They came down in Gaza, like they came down in Yamit. They'll come down, except for the ring around Jerusalem, and as you say, we agree there'll be a trade of land.
Wow, I think that you're minimizing the sense of appropriativeness on the part of the Israeli people of land. And I don't think it's the case at all that Israel was in some way coerced into occupying this part of the West Bank. I think that there is a desire. I think the greater Israel ideology, while it may have been no longer explicitly espoused, is still part and parcel of a great deal of the narrative. And it was a more severe problem than you're making it out to be.
Okay.
It's true that 8,000 Gazans were evacuated, but now you're going to have about 80,000 settlers
in a heartbeat.
Who will need to be. I'm afraid that that there will be some forms of civil insurrection.
There will not.
The IDF, as you know, the middle rung of army leadership, is now peopled largely by the settler community. There is a religious ideology at play here, which is only rivaled by some of the Islamist ideologies.
No, you can't mean that. Jews don't go around killing people. They don't fly planes into buildings. Why would you compare the two?
I'm saying, again, I want to say...
Are there Jewish fanatics? Yes, I agree they're Jewish fanatics. Mm-hmm. But they don't operate the same way. And none of that. They are held in contempt by the vast majority of Jews and Israelis. They're held in contempt.
Baruch, the state has refused to bar people from praying, from showing homage to Baruch Goldstein's memorial. This seems to me, Jews are not free of sin.
I agree. They're not free of sin.
We are not free of sin. They have plenty of blood on their hands.
They don't have plenty. They have a little bit. Relatively, they have a little bit. But this is what I hope now, Lenny. First of all, I love talking to you. You are lovely. You're intelligent. You're articulate. I love it. I hope the audience has enjoyed you as much as I've enjoyed you. So this is what I hope. We're going to watch this together. And again, I consider myself to be, although in this discussion I may seem to be the only, I tend to see myself a much more liberal than I am on the right. And again, you should have only heard me with Yishai Fleischer. But my point is, I hope you and I get a chance to see which one of us is right on what will happen on the West Bank if peace is made. Because I predict that there will be virtually no civil unrest and no violent resurrection. There'll be people who will give the army a really hard time getting them into trucks, and not worse than that. And there'll be maybe minor, small pockets of kind of crazy.
I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right, and I hope you and I get a chance to see if I'm right, because if it'll only happen if Netanyahu and Abbas in the next year work it out. So I'm asking you, would you please continue this dialogue with me over time?
I will.
As we look at it. I will invite you back often. Sometimes if we have round tables, maybe you'll be a part of them as well.
I would enjoy that.
But I cannot thank you enough, for letting me push you and argue with you. And you are articulate and you are lovely. It's been a real honor to meet you.
It's been a pleasure for me. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for saying that. Absolutely, many times. And those were the thoughts of Dr. Leonard Grob, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at New Jersey's Fairleigh Dickinson University. And he co-authored and co-edited Teen Voices from the Holy Land, published by Prometheus Books of Amherst, New York. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed by Lenny Grob. Please email me or write me this week. And if you want to be in touch with Lenny Grob, you can do so through me. Send me an email, and I will forward it on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.